The Caribbean Sea was, just a sheet of dark, shimmering glass in the pre-dawn hours of November 21, 2025. Aboard the USS George Washington, the gentle hum of a city at sea was the only sound, a constant reminder of the immense power coiled within the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Most of the nearly 5,000 sailors and aviators aboard were asleep, trusting the vigilant watch of their shipmates. But at 4:19 a.m., that deep calm was, suddenly shattered. On the radar screens in the Combat Information Center, 3 unidentified contacts appeared, moving fast. They were coming from the direction of the Venezuelan coast, closing the distance with a speed that suggested hostile intent, not a routine patrol. For the men and women on watch, this was the moment their training had prepared them for. It was not a drill. The contacts were quickly identified as fighter jets, and their trajectory was aggressive. They weren't flying parallel to the carrier strike group or maintaining a respectful distance. Instead, they were on a direct intercept course, a cutoff angle approach that NATO doctrine defines as attack geometry. The quiet professionalism of the bridge was replaced by a focused urgency. Voices became sharper, commands were given with crisp precision, and every eye was fixed on the developing situation. This was a direct challenge to the United States Navy, unfolding in real time over international waters. The atmosphere inside the massive warship grew tense. A Level 3 alert echoed through the passageways, a signal that a potential threat was imminent. Sailors, once in their racks, were now scrambling to their battle stations. The ship was waking up, not with a slow yawn, but with a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The approaching jets were not just a blip on a screen. They represented a sovereign nation testing the resolve of a superpower. Every person on board, from the captain on the bridge to the youngest enlisted sailor in the engine room, understood the gravity of the situation. A single miscalculation, a single moment of failed discipline, could ignite a conflict. The jets were now clearly identified. 3 Venezuelan SU30 MK2s, advanced Russian-made fighters known for their speed and maneuverability. They were flying in a tight V formation, a classic military display of purpose and unity. As they screamed through the dark sky, they broke the sound barrier, pushing past Mach 1 before beginning a steep dive from 2,000 feet. Their target was unmistakable, the USS George Washington. The pilots were not on a simple reconnaissance mission. Their goal was to force the colossal American carrier, a symbol of global power, to alter its course, to yield its position in the face of their high-speed charge. The maneuver executed by the 3 Venezuelan SU30 MK2 pilots was far from a simple flyby or a mistaken approach. It was a meticulously planned and highly provocative act, designed to communicate a message of defiance. After their initial supersonic burst, the jets began a dramatic dive, first descending to 5,700 feet and then dropping further to 4,300 feet. As they did so, they reduced their speed from a blistering Mach 1.2 to a still formidable Mach 0.92. This controlled descent was a textbook example of a high-risk intercept, designed to intimidate and to create a dangerous situation that the U.S. carrier would be forced to react to. The term used by military analysts for this type of approach is a cutoff angle. Instead of flying alongside the carrier group, the jets positioned themselves to cross its path directly. This created an invisible wall in the carrier's flight corridor, a zone of extreme danger. The sheer physics of the situation made it risky. An aircraft carrier, despite its immense power, is not a nimble vessel. It weighs over 100,000 tons and cannot swerve or stop quickly. The Venezuelan pilots were exploiting this very fact, betting that the American commander would choose to alter course to avoid a potential collision, rather than risk the lives of thousands in a multi-billion-dollar warship. This was not a random act of bravado. It was a calculated military operation with a clear political objective. By forcing the USS George Washington to change its path, Venezuela would score a significant political and propaganda victory. It would demonstrate that even with its degraded military, it could establish a de facto security zone and compel a superpower to back down. The jets closed to within 10 nautical miles of the carrier group, a distance that, in the world of modern naval warfare, is considered the maximum tactical risk zone. Inside this bubble, reaction times are measured in seconds, and the margin for error is virtually zero. The intentions of the pilots were therefore universally interpreted by the U.S. Navy as hostile. There was no ambiguity, no room for misunderstanding. This was not a patrol that had strayed off course or a training exercise gone wrong. The tight V formation, the supersonic approach, the aggressive dive profile, and the direct intercept course all pointed to one conclusion: this was a deliberate threat. The Venezuelan pilots were playing a dangerous game of chicken, using their fast and agile fighter jets against a naval behemoth, gambling that the Americans would be the first to flinch in this high-stakes standoff over the Caribbean. To understand why Venezuela would risk such a dangerous confrontation, one must look at the broader context of late 2025. The incident did not happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating tensions, marked by a significant American military buildup in the Caribbean. In October, the Trump administration had ordered a powerful array of assets to the region. This included not just one, but two carrier strike groups, led by the USS Gerald R. Ford and the USS George Washington. They were supported by destroyers, a nuclear submarine, F-35 fighters, and even heavy bombers like the B-1 and B-52. This formidable show of force was a clear message to the government in Caracas. For Venezuela, whose economy had been crippled by years of collapse and international sanctions, this military presence was an existential threat. The nation's own military was a shadow of its former self. While its Air Force technically possessed a fleet of Su-30 and F-16 fighters, open-source intelligence suggested that only a handful were actually combat-ready. Cannibalizing parts from grounded aircraft to keep a few flying was standard practice. Faced with the overwhelming might of the U.S. military, President Maduro's government was in a desperate position. The maneuver on November 21st was, therefore, an act of asymmetric posturing. Knowing they could not win a conventional war, the Venezuelan leadership opted for a high-risk, high-reward strategy. The goal was not to sink the carrier, but to score a psychological victory. If they could force the USS George Washington to alter its course, they could broadcast this to the world as proof that they had successfully defended their sovereignty against American aggression. It would be a powerful propaganda tool, both for a domestic audience and for their international allies, suggesting that Venezuela was unbowed and capable of standing up to a superpower. This was a gamble born of weakness, not strength. President Maduro had publicly pleaded for peace even as his military prepared for these provocative actions. The aggressive flight of the Su-30s was a desperate attempt to create leverage where none existed, to turn a dire military imbalance into a political win. The pilots were likely following direct orders from the highest levels of government, tasked with pushing the boundaries of international norms to their absolute limit. They were a pawn in a much larger geopolitical game, their mission to create a crisis that might force the United States to the negotiating table, or, at the very least, make it think twice about its next move. Aboard the USS George Washington, the response to the approaching threat was a masterclass in naval discipline. There was no panic, no chaos. Instead, the ship's crew executed a series of well-rehearsed procedures designed to manage a crisis without escalating it. The captain and the command staff on the bridge had a clear objective: to demonstrate unshakable resolve without firing a single shot. The first and most critical decision was made immediately. The carrier would not alter its course. To do so would be to hand the Venezuelan pilots the very victory they were seeking. The ship would hold its path, a silent and powerful statement that it would not be intimidated. Across the vast warship, the Level 3 alert had brought the crew to a state of heightened readiness. On the flight deck, crews began preparing aircraft, ensuring that interceptors could be launched in minutes if needed. Below decks, damage control teams stood by, ready to respond to any eventuality. In the Combat Information Center, sailors tracked the Su-30s with unblinking focus, feeding a constant stream of information to the command team. Every department, from engineering to weapon systems, was now at its highest state of alert, a complex human and mechanical system working in perfect synchronization. The ship was a coiled spring, ready to react with overwhelming force if necessary. This response was not about aggression. It was about control. The U.S. Navy's doctrine in such situations is to de-escalate through strength. The goal is to show the adversary that their actions are being monitored, that you are prepared for any outcome, and that any further hostile moves will be met with a swift and decisive counter. By refusing to change course, the carrier denied the Venezuelans their primary objective: By bringing the ship to a full state of alert, it sent a clear signal that the American crew was prepared for the worst, removing any doubt about their readiness to defend themselves. The atmosphere was electric, but it was an electricity born of focus, not fear. The sailors and officers aboard the USS George Washington were professionals. They understood the stakes and trusted their training, their equipment, and their leadership. They were part of a multi-layered response that involved not just their own ship, but the entire carrier strike group. The carrier's steadfastness was the anchor of this response, a powerful, silent message that the United States Navy would not be pushed out of international waters. The next move in this dangerous chess match would come from the carrier's escorts. As the USS George Washington held its course, a key component of the American response was set in motion. The carrier was not alone. It was the centerpiece of a strike group, protected by a screen of highly capable escort vessels. One of these, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Gravely, DDG-107, was tasked with a critical role. While the massive carrier maintained its steady path, the much more agile destroyer sprang into action. With a surge of power from its gas turbine engines, the Gravely accelerated, cutting through the water with precision and speed. It was not a random movement, it was a calculated tactical maneuver. The destroyer executed a precise arc turn, a graceful but powerful curve that positioned it directly between the carrier and the incoming Venezuelan jets. It was essentially stepping into the line of fire. This single action served multiple purposes. First, it physically shielded the more vulnerable, high-value asset, the aircraft carrier. Should the situation escalate and weapons be fired, the destroyer was now the first line of defense. This is a primary role of an escort vessel, to protect the carrier at all costs, even if it means putting itself in harm's way. The crew of the Gravely knew this was their duty. Second, the maneuver was a powerful and undeniable signal to the SU-30 pilots. By moving so decisively into their projected flight path, the USS Gravely was communicating a non-verbal message. We see you, we know your intentions, and we are prepared to intercept you. It changed the tactical geometry of the encounter. The Venezuelan pilots were no longer just facing a large, slow-moving target. They were now being confronted by a dedicated warship specifically designed to engage and destroy air threats. This forced them to reassess the risk of their aggressive approach. Finally, the positioning of the USS Gravely was a brilliant example of de-escalation through positional dominance. The destroyer did not fire its weapons, or even lock its radar onto the jets in an aggressive targeting mode. It simply moved. By placing itself in the way, it established control over the situation without firing a shot. It created a new reality for the Venezuelan pilots, one in which continuing their current path would be exponentially more dangerous. The silent, swift movement of the destroyer was a more powerful deterrent than a shouted warning, a clear demonstration of capability and intent. As the USS Gravely maneuvered into its blocking position, another layer of the American response was unfolding. From the destroyer's flight deck, the powerful rotors of an MH-60R Seahawk helicopter began to spin. Within moments, the helicopter lifted off, climbing rapidly into the dark morning sky. This was not a combat helicopter armed for an attack. It was a multi-mission aircraft primarily used for surveillance and anti-submarine warfare. Its launch was another carefully calibrated step in the U.S. Navy strategy of controlled de-escalation. The Seahawk was about to become the high-altitude eyes of the strike group. The presence of the helicopter immediately added a new dimension to the standoff. From its vantage point, high above the ocean surface, the Seahawk's crew had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire scene. They could watch the Venezuelan jets, monitor their altitude and speed, and observe their every move with advanced optical and electronic sensors. This information was relayed in real time back to the command centers on both the Gravely and the George Washington, providing the American commanders with perfect situational awareness. The SU-30 pilots were no longer just being tracked by radar, they were being physically watched. This act of surveillance served as a form of soft deterrence. It sent a clear message to the Venezuelan pilots that their actions were being recorded and documented. In any potential international incident, having clear evidence is crucial. The helicopter was, in effect, a witness, ensuring that there would be no ambiguity about who was the aggressor if the situation turned hostile. This psychological pressure can be a powerful tool. Pilots undertaking a provocative mission are far less comfortable when they know that a neutral, recording eye is fixed upon them, cataloging their every maneuver for later review by the world. Furthermore, the helicopter's presence complicated the tactical picture for the Su-30s. While the Seahawk is not a fighter jet, it is not defenseless. Its presence in the airspace, between the jets and the carrier group, created another obstacle, another factor for the Venezuelan pilots to consider. They were now operating in a more crowded and monitored environment. The launch of the helicopter was a simple, low-risk action, but it had a significant strategic impact. It demonstrated that the U.S. Navy could control the airspace around its fleet, adding another layer of pressure without ever needing to escalate to the level of a direct threat. While the USS Gravely moved and the Seahawk climbed, a more subtle but equally powerful message was being sent from the destroyer's decks. The ship's weapon systems began to stir. On the forward deck, the large 5-inch Mark 45 gun turret, normally pointed straight ahead, began to rotate. It swung slowly and deliberately, its long barrel turning to face the direction of the approaching Su-30s. At the same time, the Phalanx CIWS, a rapid-fire Gatling gun designed as a last line of defense against incoming missiles and aircraft, also swiveled to cover the same threat axis. Crucially, this was a passive display of readiness. The weapons were not armed in a way that suggested an imminent attack. The Aegis SPY-1 radar system, the powerful heart of the destroyer's air defense network, remained at a reduced output. It was not painting the Venezuelan jets with a targeting lock, an act that is universally considered hostile and a final precursor to firing. Instead, the movement of the gun turrets was a form of body language. It was the naval equivalent of turning to face an opponent and crossing one's arms, a clear, unambiguous signal that said, "I am ready." This silent communication is a vital part of modern military encounters. It allows one side to demonstrate its capability and resolve without taking an irreversible step towards conflict. For the Venezuelan pilots, looking down from their cockpits, the sight of these weapon systems turning to face them would have been unmistakable. They would have known instantly that their approach had been detected and that the American warship was prepared to defend itself with lethal force. The message was clear: proceed any further and you will be crossing a line from which there is no return. This careful posturing is the difference between deterrence and provocation. By keeping the radar in a passive mode, the U.S. Navy avoided escalating the situation. A full-power radar lock could have been interpreted by the Venezuelan pilots as an attack, potentially causing them to react defensively and trigger a shooting war. By simply moving the hardware into position, the USS Gravely communicated its preparedness without issuing a direct threat. It was a masterful display of discipline, showing that the crew was in complete control of its systems and its actions, ready to act but not eager for a fight. The combined effect of the American response was decisive. The Venezuelan pilots, faced with this multi-layered and unflinching display of resolve, made their choice. They had flown their high-speed, aggressive profile, closing to the edge of the tactical risk zone. But the U.S. Navy had not flinched. The carrier had not changed course. A destroyer had moved to block their path. A helicopter was watching them from above, and the weapons on the destroyer were pointed directly at their approach vector. They had tested the American will and found it to be made of steel. Having failed to achieve their primary objective of forcing the carrier to yield, the pilots broke off their attack run. The tight V formation dissolved as the three Su-30 MK2s banked away from the carrier strike group and set a course back towards the Venezuelan coast. The immediate crisis was over. The game of chicken had ended, and the side with the cooler head and steadier hand had prevailed. There were no victory rolls, no celebratory radio calls from the American side. There was only the quiet, professional return to a normal state of readiness. The jets were tracked, and das ilade major for bearing desensem and neister bur borisgrod. Sogman esper nast sor. Sondains denst some bestens doing esker ensure. And the alert level was eventually lowered. The success of the U.S. response lay in its perfect calibration. It was firm enough to be undeniable but restrained enough to avoid sparking a war. Every action taken by the U.S. Navy was defensive in nature. Moving a destroyer, launching a surveillance helicopter, and pointing weapons in a passive mode are all acts of preparation, not aggression. This gave the Venezuelan pilots an off-ramp, a way to back down without being shot at. By not locking its radar or firing a warning shot, the U.S. Navy left the door open for de-escalation, and the Venezuelan pilots took it. This incident serves as a textbook example of de-escalation through strength. The United States did not yield to intimidation, which would have only invited more aggressive behavior in the future, but it also did not respond with excessive force, which could have ignited a regional conflict with tragic consequences. Instead, it demonstrated its superior capability and unwavering discipline, making it clear to the adversary that their course of action was futile and incredibly risky. The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with the quiet departure of the challengers, their gamble having failed completely. The tense moments in the Caribbean on November 21, 2025, offer profound lessons about the nature of modern military standoffs. In an era of instant communication and high-tech weaponry, the space between peace and war can be terrifyingly small. This incident highlights above all the critical importance of discipline. The hundreds of sailors aboard the USS George Washington and USS Gravely performed their duties with a level of professionalism that prevented a dangerous situation from spiraling into a catastrophe. Their calm, practiced response under immense pressure was the single most important factor in the peaceful resolution of the crisis. The event also underscores the importance of clear, unambiguous signaling. In a confrontation where spoken words are impossible or impractical, actions become the language of communication. The U.S. Navy's response was a symphony of clear signals. The carrier holding its course signaled resolve. The destroyer's movement signaled interception. The helicopter's launch signaled surveillance, and the weapon's silent posture signaled readiness. Each action was carefully chosen to convey a specific message, leaving no room for misinterpretation. This clarity removed the guesswork for the Venezuelan pilots and made their decision to retreat the only logical choice. Furthermore, the standoff demonstrates the principle that true strength lies not just in firepower, but in the restraint with which it is wielded. The most powerful weapon the U.S. Navy deployed that morning was not a missile or a gun, but its own discipline. By refusing to be baited into an aggressive response, the American commanders retained control of the situation and denied their adversaries the conflict they may have been trying to provoke. This shows that refusing to yield to intimidation does not require a violent response. Often, the most powerful move is a display of unshakable calm and readiness. Ultimately, the Caribbean Standoff was a reminder that in high-stakes international incidents, the human element remains paramount. Technology provides the tools, but it is the judgment, training, and character of the men and women operating that technology that determine the outcome. The sailors of the U.S. Navy looked into the abyss of a potential conflict, and, through their discipline and resolve, stepped back from the brink. The lesson for nations everywhere is clear. In moments of tension, strength without wisdom is reckless, but resolve without action is meaningless. The balance between the two is the key to navigating the dangerous waters of global politics.